the reviving of characters and whether or not it works inside of stories. Now, I've been recently contemplating this idea because before I would be complaining about the idea of a character coming back to life within a story. And now looking back on it, I'm starting to think about like how the context really plays into whether or not a story actually works when it comes to revivification. Because like I was looking on Mal the other day, and actually a couple minutes ago too, and I was looking at Shaman King, one of my favorite shonens review, and its review on Mal is 7.9. It's not a bad score per se, but if I were to review, Shaman King, I would have given it like a 9 or a 10. Like, it's easily one of the best written shonens ever, and I'm not even really a shonen fan. Like, as much as I have like shonen on my shelves, I have seinen, and a lot of my favorite series, especially in my top 5, they're all seinen series. So like I never really, I grew up on shonen, but I grew up on Studio Ghibli, so shonen. But at the end of the day, when I looked at that score, a lot of people's issue with the story was the fact that characters could come back to life. That, and also the fact that they felt like, Hayo, the main antagonist, didn't necessarily change at the end of the series. But I could talk about that in the completely different videos. In this video, I'm just going to talk about reviving. Now, when it comes to the idea of revival is when in a narrative, you bring a character back to life. Simple as that. It happens in Dragon Ball Z. It happens in Hunter x Hunter in one occurrence. It happens in Yu Yu Hakusho, right? It happens in Seven Deadly Sins. It happens in Naruto. It happens in a lot of shonen series. It's just a very common thing. It happens inside of Fairy Tail. Or at least, in Fairy Tail, it's like characters are close to dying and they just don't die for some reason. But basically, a lot of the reason why death is such a big deal inside of narratives is because it's so finite. So a lot of people, like when they're writing something to really show the cause of something or the effect that something has, is when a character is taken out of the story permanently. And the only way that can happen is through death, for the most part. In some cases, death is a necessity within the story to really add weight to it. Like, for example, in like one of my favorite series, Legend of the Galactic Heroes. It's not a shonen. One of the number one things it does really well is its uses of death in order to convey cause and effect, and how a single character dying can affect the overall plot of the story and how each and every other character relates with one another. It even happens in stuff outside of anime, like Game of Thrones. Like Game of Thrones, mortality is one of the biggest things in that story because it adds to the level of depth within that story. It happens in Berserk as well with the whole Eclipse stuff. The Eclipse stuff was a big deal because all the characters died and it was a finite death, But what about in cases where it doesn't work? A case where it really doesn't work are Akame ga Kill and Gantz. Those are two major series that I think about, and even High School of the Dead. Like, they'll kill off characters that don't really even undergo that much development and then expect you to really care about when they die. It's like, how do you expect to care when most of the characters in Akame ga Kill die, when it all happens at once, and it's all just for shock value, and a lot of them were mostly tropes to begin with. Like, they had very little to their personality, so it was like, why was I supposed to care? The same thing goes for Gantz. Like, a lot of the characters in Gantz were just jerks. Like, I didn't like any of them, for the most part, except for, like, maybe that one dude, the tall dude, I forgot his name, but that's the only character that you really cared for. Everyone else was jerks, so if they died, you were like, so what, In High School of the Dead, later on, they would just introduce characters just to kill them off, and you're just like, it's death for the sake of death, Death for making stories edgy, and even the beginning of Attack on Titan. Like the beginning of Attack on Titan, as much as people love it, my number one issue with it was that it didn't really do much in way to develop a lot of the characters that it did kill off. So when they did, it was like not that big of a deal. Like I really didn't care when X person got eaten by a Titan. The only thing that was interesting about it was the method by which it was done. It was very flashy, very impactful, you know. But in the instance of revival, in narratives, I find a lot of examples of stories looking back that actually handle it pretty well. I mean, sure, you have examples like Dragon Ball Z, where they use the Dragon Balls whenever someone dies, so the threat of death isn't really there. You have examples like Promised Neverland, where they'll set up to where someone is going to die and then they end up not really being dead, which is similar to Fairy Tale. And the problem with that is the whole idea is false suspense and destroying the tension within the story. But I can name a number of examples of where it actually worked. I mean, to me, it also didn't work inside of Naruto. But I have to make an entire extensive rant video when it comes to Naruto because I've been meaning to put something like that out. But moving forward from that, examples of revivification that I felt actually worked would have to be inside of Shaman King and Seven Deadly Sins. And the only reason why I'm mainly going to cover Shaman King is due to the simple fact that it's the series that I feel score suffered the most, even though it wasn't necessarily warranted. And the reason why is because death and the afterlife played such an important role in the development of the characters. Shaman King is it's a series that explores the duality of the human world and the spirit world. Now, people don't normally believe in the spirit world. You know, I'm not even going to go into beliefs here, but in a story where it's established that there is a spirit world, there is an afterlife, and the idea of revival or resurrection was something that was established very early on in the series when you had the main antagonist, Hayo, who would come back to life on several occasions, and he had his own study of spirituality book called the Chosenji Ryaketsu, which had an understanding of how you can revive. You know, it was a possibility, you know. In Shaman King, the first character that experienced revival was Chocolove, the black character, one of my favorite characters, McDonald's. He's one of my favorite characters in all of Shonen. When he underwent it, he had to sort of face the music of his past, because he used to be a member of a gang, and in that gang, he killed this one young guy's father, you know, and he had to sort of reconcile with the death that he had caused and learn to repent for it. Because in the series of Shaman King, basically all of heaven, all of the afterlife exists within the Great Spirit, because the Great Spirit is a culmination of all of the entities within the world. When things die, they go back to the Great Spirit, right? In Shaman King, this is something as a rule within the series, right? When characters die and they experience this quote-unquote hell, hell is ultimately a reflection of the personal strife and sort of issues that character has, and the grief of that character is all personified within their hell. So ultimately, hell, as opposed to being this place where you are permanently condemned, is a place for you to eventually get over your issues so that you can be, you know, reborn, or so that your spirit can move to higher levels of the Great Spirit, you know. When Chocolove goes in there, he has to face his own demons and overcome them to come back. And when he does come back, he decides to come back and sacrifice his eyesight, because it is sort of his repentance for what he did. So his character ultimately developed because of his experience there. He learned that he learned how to forgive himself and to accept himself after that experience there. So really, it did more in way to develop the characters as opposed to just being a plot convenience. Like, it was more than just a plot convenience. It was something to push them to new heights and to have a greater understanding of themselves and the world around them, because ultimately the power system in Shaman King, how Furyoku works, is the idea of increasing your knowledge base and your spiritual awareness, and that's the only way that you become a stronger shaman in Shaman King. So through experiencing the afterlife in that series, it sort of allowed them to expand their horizons, which in way led to ultimately their challenge with Hayo. And one thing I actually liked about Shaman King is that they didn't win at the end. Spoilers, they didn't win. I'm not going to tell you how, but they don't. It does more in way with development of them in the story, and they have to sort of learn other paths, other methods of living their life when their goals, they don't necessarily accomplish their goals, so they have to sort of evolve as people to gain new goals, which I feel is even more important and impactful than the characters even achieving their goals. Because you can have a character achieve their goal, but it's not just about what that character wants, it's about what that character needs to understand about themselves to become a better person. And Shaman King does that in its series, which a lot of other series don't necessarily do. You know, the character development in that series is very poignant, especially with characters like Taorin and Horo. If we're talking about, you know, series like Hunter x Hunter is another example of a series where revival was used, but I felt like it was a necessity to be used. Spoilers. Anyone who's watching this video, skip, because I'm about to spoil something. During the election arc, there's the whole stuff involving Aluka and Gon being brought back to life. Now, a lot of people had issues with this point within the story. However, it was established that characters can be stronger and things can happen as long as there's a high enough stipulation. It works the same as Full Metal Alchemist. It's the idea of equivalent exchange, right? And they really went in way to really establish Aluka's abilities and the stipulations involving Aluka's abilities. However, the idea of Gon coming back was a necessity for the narrative because it would complete his story arc if Gon met his father. Like, without that whole situation, then Gon's story arc would never have been completed for the Hunter x Hunter story. So it was a necessity. But one story that I feel even went better than that was Yu Yu Hakusho. In its very beginning, a character is revived in its first arc. Yusuke Urameshi, the main character, dies. Anybody who's seen Yu Yu Hakusho knows. He dies trying to save someone, and his whole journey in the afterlife is basically going through this path to eventually be revived for the first arc, and it sort of does in way to develop his character, to develop the afterlife, and develop the world of Yu Yu Hakusho, and it really causes you to have sort of an emotional resonance with Yusuke because of the simple fact that he would risk his life to save someone, and he died just to save someone, and it showed the effect that his character had on everyone else. So it did in way to show Yusuke how important he was as a person and how he affected people. So really, revival in the narrative isn't really something that's bad. It's about how it's executed under every circumstance. When it comes to any story trope, it's about execution. It's not about whether or not the character comes back to life or not. You know? So at the end of the day, I just wanted to address the idea of revival in anime. The only examples where I can really state where it was problematic was in Dragon Ball Z and Naruto. And the reason why in Naruto was a problem is that I felt like it was a narrative escape for the writer to bring back old characters as opposed to inventing new ones to be antagonists. That's one way you could look at it. Another issue I had is the fact that the whole idea of Edo Tensei just really took away from a lot of the writing later on. I mean, it added some sort of emotional depth. I will give people that. But then again, you also have the stuff involving Naruto being able to bring Might Guy back to life, which was dumb because basically Naruto became a god at the end of the series. But that's going into a whole new territory of stuff. And that's a whole new can of worms I don't want to open right now because I can already see the Naruto fans raging in the comments about how I'm wrong. Naruto's the best series ever. Blah, 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 blah. I don't know. It's not. But, yeah. That's it for now. The Daywalker. Deuces, people.